On this episode of China Uncensored, turns out you don't want to water down the concrete in a dam. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. The promise of Chinese investment may be coming to a country near you. How, you ask? Take it away, Chinese state-run media. Chinese leader Xi Jinping has pledged to invest $1 trillion in the Belt and Road Initiative. A perfect example is Malaysia, which got $34 billion worth of it. The Chinese Communist Party saw Malaysia as the cornerstone of the Belt and Road, or maybe a belt buckle. And the Malaysian government also turned a blind eye to some rather shady construction practices. In fact, a good chunk of the money Chinese companies pumped in went through a Malaysian development company called One Malaysia Development Berhad, or 1MDB for short. And let's just say 1MDB got up to some pretty sketchy things.
The 1MDB scandal is one of the biggest alleged white-collar crimes ever. Investigators say it involves at least 10 countries, from North America to the Middle East to Asia. It also allegedly includes New York and Beverly Hills real estate, Monet and Van Gogh artworks, Las Vegas gambling, and the funding of Martin Scorsese's The Wolf of Wall Street.
Oh, Leo, say it isn't so. Under former Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak, $4.5 billion went missing from 1MDB. $700 million of that may have flowed directly into Najib's personal bank accounts. That scandal was exposed largely thanks to the work of British investigative journalist Clare Rewcastle Brown and her online news portal, the Sarawak Report. I sat down with Miss Brown on the sidelines of the Oslo Freedom Forum in Taiwan to find out the real cost of Chinese investment in Malaysia, including why you might not want to live downstream from a Chinese dam. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me here.
You seem a little...
I'm slightly, yes. I think we're going to tackle some very challenging subjects, but let's see.
Maybe. So, the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Najib Razak, has said, referring to you, that white people should stay out of Malaysia's affairs. So he reads your stuff, at least.
Oh, yes. I think they were reading everything I wrote. And it was an extraordinary imbalance. He complained that there was an imbalance in the propaganda war between me and my story about 1MDB and his entire state propaganda machinery that was directed at discrediting me and undermining what I was writing about. So yes, I agree there was a disparity, but in a different direction.
So one journalist versus the entire state apparatus.
That's how it felt for a while. As the story started to gain traction, then some of the other big media organizations came in, thank goodness. And of course, once the United States surprised everyone by bringing out a comprehensive investigation into the 1MDB scandal, then I started to feel I had strength behind me too.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, as I understand it, Leonardo DiCaprio helped you crack the case of the big 1MDB scandal.
Oh, no, he didn't. We were constantly Facebook messaging and tweeting at Leo to say...
Did he write back?
No, he ignored us with a great aloofness. But we were trying to warn him for many months that his best friends, the people who were whisking him off by private jet to the casinos of Las Vegas and paying for the chips and all the entertainment, might actually be somewhat toxic. And that far from being an environmental friendly venture, they were also involved in massive deforestation and oil palm cultivation, all of which, if he'd bothered to look, given the connections between these guys and the Malaysian government and between the Malaysian government and oil palm and deforestation, was perfectly open source and easily accessible information, if he or his team had bothered to take a look.
So you feel like Leo didn't care too much that his film Wolf of Wall Street was being financed by some dubious people?
Well, if he did care, he kept it a bit of a secret. He was very happy to accept extremely expensive gifts from Jolo, great partying at Jolo's expense, and floated around on some of their incredibly unenvironmentally friendly super yachts, didn't he?
And just for the audience, would you mind saying who Jolo is? I keep wanting to say J-Lo.
Well, he was known as J-Lo. He was in a kind of sort of play on the Great Gatsby sort of kind of entity that he became.
Also for his full figure, but...
Well, yes. Jolo was the young 20-something Chinese Malaysian so-called businessman who became the supposed advisor on 1MDB to Najib Razak, the Prime Minister of Malaysia. He was soon to disown that role and pretend that he wasn't involved in 1MDB, but everyone was clear that he had been, and effectively he was the person behind the various schemes for pulling out the money, and he was the front for those schemes, and eventually all that money was traced through accounts that he controlled.
Well, do you think when they make the Hollywood adaptation of your story, maybe Leo can play you and make up for her?
Well, you know, I understand that Leo DiCaprio is a very concerned environmentalist, and indeed he went and made a film about his environmental proclivities and so forth. And he did eventually, when the DOJ issued its indictments, he did give back the Picasso that Jolo had given him and various other...
Picasso?
Wow. Yes. I mean, you know, if you're Leo DiCaprio, I presume that you'll get, you know, gifts that are worth receiving.
Amazing.
But he did hand those back, yeah, but, you know, I think there are going to be a few movies about this where he could play himself, actor number one, as the DOJ described him in their depositions.
That's an amazing sense of humor the DOJ has.
Well, everybody got a tag. Actually, I think Leo DiCaprio was Hollywood actor one. Then there was Hollywood supermodel one. I think that was Miranda Kerr, who got $8 million worth of diamonds. I think Joe must have fancied her. He gave her a heart pendant with matching sort of pink earrings and stuff
He came
as
on
a
too
Valentine
hard.
gift. Well, she was happy to take a Valentine's inaugural twirl around the Caribbean in his $250 million new super yacht. She actually, I think, was his first guest on that.
Well, so speaking of this, how do global financial institutions help enable this kind of corruption in Malaysia?
This was where I really got stuck in on this story. I mean, I began by looking at a very, localized tragedy, which was the destruction of the Borneo rainforest, which was where I'd grown up. So it was a local story. I felt like a local girl with a conscience wanting to bring attention to this neglected global tragedy. But very soon, I realized the global implications of what I was looking at as a sort of, in a way, a case study of what's happening everywhere, I have come to believe. Trying to trace the corruption that was driving all this deforestation, the ill governance and basically the theft of public funds that was behind all of this, I soon found, like anyone who tries to investigate criminal money, that it would disappear into an offshore company somewhere, you know, in the islands of the Caribbean or elsewhere, and you couldn't pursue it further by the normal open source methods, and so you would then see these wealthy local politicians, popping up with their property empires, you know, around the developed economies, but impossible to keep the money trails. And what I realized was that we have a global system set up perfectly to enable the theft of huge sums of money from areas where, you know, people are vulnerable, where governance is poor, into our economies, and it's all being facilitated by our global financial institutions using the offshore system and interfacing with it. So you would see major banks and their wealth management departments interfacing with the offshore companies that these kleptocrats were using to siphon out their cash. And of course then there was a whole legion of professionals from developed economies, lawyers and media people like me to give the good publicity, businessmen to help them invest their money, offshore incorporators, tax avoidance advisors, and all the rest.
And what was China's role in the 1MDB scandal?
This has always been geopolitical. The failure to come down on these sorts of kleptocracies has been geopolitical. These areas of poor governance where you've seen, small tin pot dictators act with impunity against their own people. They've been allowed to get away with it because of the rivalry between great powers and nations. And when America moved against the pro-Western leaning government of Najib Razak, he reacted by turning to China. And not least because he'd got himself into such a big financial mess over 1MDB. He'd stolen all the money, he'd then got caught. He was finding it very difficult to find ways of secretly repaying all the debts on these missing billions without it being found out. He had a flotation plan that was going to get him off the hook and bring in lots of government firms that were going to control companies were going to presumably come in and buy some of that flotation. And I think the plan as constructed actually by his advisors from Goldman Sachs, and of course we can come on to them, but they were suggesting that this whole thing could be floated away and no one would notice the missing billions. It didn't happen because of the exposés. So Najib was left with a financial problem. How was he going to repay these gaping debts that he was pretending to everyone weren't owed by 1MDB? They were owed, and the money had been stolen, so they couldn't pay the money back. And what he did was send his proxy, the same Joe Low, off to China, where certain deals were negotiated that put Malaysia very much in hock to the Chinese, left them very exposed to loans from the Chinese.
China has been investing heavily in Malaysia. What is their interest in Malaysia?
Well, I think they're seeking to expand their power. They're a superpower. They're beginning, as everyone knows, to become more assertive. And Malaysia is a neighbour that it would like to have within its sphere of interest. And what happened, because of Najib's financial difficulty, he was nearly dropped his rich and independent country like a ripe plum into the lap of China, because he needed someone to secretly bail out his debts on 1MDB. So therefore, he agreed to a rail project. China's transport policy that we all know about was being projected to go down through the east coast of Malaysia to Singapore. There was an East Coast Rail project which had been talked of, had been projected at being worth 30 billion ringgit. Suddenly, in the midst of all this crisis, there was an announcement that it had been revised upwards by 100%. This rail project was now to be 60 billion ringgit. And shortly after that announcement was floated, I very conveniently received an anonymous document. And that anonymous document was the secret manifest behind that revised contract. And the secret manifest showed how that extra 100% inflation of the contract money was agreed between both parties. That was the Chinese state company C4 and Malaysian government to actually secretly cover those repayments on 1MDB. And there was a list there of every single repayment owed and the date it was due, and an agreement that this Chinese company would pay it. He also got a 7-year holiday on repayments, a 2% soft loan, and indeed some of Joe Low's companies were conveniently thrown into the mix so he could sell them off as well, thanks to that corrupt project that clearly the Chinese government had been complicit in.
So the corruption in Malaysia was an opportunity for China to expand its One Belt, One Road initiative.
Exactly. It enabled China to get its grips on Malaysia's economy.
So one of China's infrastructure projects in Malaysia is called Forest City. It's basically a resort community on artificial islands they're building off the coast of Malaysia. China's great at building fake islands, but do you think there might be a chance that corruption is involved in any of this?
Well, I have been looking at a number of mega projects involving China across Malaysia, including mega dam projects in Sarawak, which is where I first started trying to expose corruption that was destroying the Borneo rainforest, and indeed elsewhere. And I've yet to find a situation where corruption hasn't been involved. Forest City was, again, a state-level project. Although, of course, it was sanctioned at federal level. It was the most massive construction. It was plumping a city down in the state of Johor. Huge areas of state land had been appropriated, and there are several questions about how that was done and who profited, but it is generally agreed that certain politically powerful entities made squillions out of taking that land in a very questionable way from the public purse, and that money went into a limited number of powerful pockets. I was banned from Malaysia for many years. The last time I had visited Johor was perhaps nearly 10 years ago, when you crossed over from Singapore into a rather delightful and traditional, old-fashioned, not very heavily populated place. I went back just a few weeks ago and was astonished to see a towering Asian city that had just grown up. Massive investment, the usual tower blocks, swirling roadways, and all the rest. But this was sort of kind of plonked down on a Malaysian economy. This was a city that was being financed and funded and then sold to people in China. The people who were coming to live there were people coming to seeking to invest funds out of China. Malaysia has a population of about 13 million people, and Forest City was designed to accommodate just under 1 million people. And it was plain that all the buyers were going to be from China. So that's a lot of people just to import, as it were, into the middle of one of your cities, in one fell swoop, in a sort of purchase of an area. And I think it raised, a lot of concerns in Malaysia. There are hopefully depreciating ethnic tensions between the Malays and the very large Chinese population. A lot of that has been, overcome, and I hope going forward that, that Malaysia will, survive very well as a multicultural, multi-racial country. But to bring in 1 million people from another country who don't speak your language and plop them in to the middle of the capital city, that created anxiety, as it probably would anywhere. The new Prime Minister has raised this, questioned it, and made the very good question as to why all these properties were sold to incoming Chinese. And I think the question of corruption is right up there at the top of the list,
Tell me a bit more about the mega dams.
Well, this is where I really have encountered Chinese corrupt practice in Malaysia, and I think that this is something that has been duplicated elsewhere. But China has been willing to come in and engage in the building of a number of highly controversial and contentious mega dams in Sarawak. Now, we're talking about a rainforest state, crisscrossed with wonderful rivers, wild rivers. And we're talking about the most biodiverse rainforest region on Earth, the third largest and the oldest rainforest, most species left in one place on Earth. Wow. A very valuable natural heritage. The destructive impact of these vast dam projects.
Please use the term mega dam as much as possible.
All right, well, the destructive impact of these vast dam projects, mega dams that the chief minister of the time, now governor, was proposing to build, cannot be underestimated. The chief minister of Sarawak started off round about 2008 with a plan to build 12 mega dams in Sarawak, which were going to flood huge areas of the country, creating, of course, enormous global warming, destroying the concept of Sarawak being a rainforest state. He was planning to turn it into a massive industrial zone using the hydropower of these mega dams. Many dam building companies across the world, were nervous about getting involved in this particular highly controversial and destructive projects. But China has proved very willing to test out the technology that it picked up on the Three Gorges Dam project, and to roll it out into places like Sarawak. Pretty new at the job, but that didn't stop them from getting involved in the second highest dam in the world, one of the biggest dam lakes, the Bakun Dam, second only to the Three Gorges Dam in China. Chinese companies were involved in building that. And I very soon got involved in covering that as a reporter. What I started to investigate was how these dams were being built, what came out was that there were major problems about the construction of these dams in terms of safety, in terms of work practice. With the Bakun Dam, I received documentation and video that showed that the Chinese work teams on the ground were watering down the concrete dangerously in order to make their job easier, for example. When I brought out these stories, of course, this was all denied, but it remains as a danger in that lake. The Chinese then engaged with the corrupted Chief Minister of Sarawak in building a secret dam further up the same river, known as the Muram Dam. For 2 years, that site was blasted out secretly in the jungle, in the traditional areas of the iconic Penan nomadic hunters, one of the last nomadic hunter tribes in Asia. And those nomads were evicted from their lands, and the Muram Dam was then built. Now, the Muram Dam, again, built with Chinese technology, Chinese labor. You went into the jungle and suddenly there were all these Chinese signs. Again, there were massive hidden problems with the dam because it was an afterthought for the Bakun Dam, which was further down the river, down a 70-mile gorge. And I discovered the secret environmental impact assessments, which showed that should there be a problem with Muram Dam, any failure there could create what they called a highly likely scenario of a cascading catastrophe of water pouring down, hitting the second highest dam wall in the world, which I had already established had been
made with watered down concrete.
Exactly, with inadequate technology, and half the population of Sarawak labour below that, and the potential 100-foot wave that would then go down. So these are all stories that I have tried to cover. And finally, and worse, the turbines that were to go into this Muram Dam that was threatening the lower dam turned out to be defective, and they inserted those turbines that were made in Harbin in a totally negligent way, so that they were full of cracks and pits as they were, and this was only found out after they had been inserted by a Norwegian consultancy company that came and had a look. And what that meant was that as the warm water comes under enormous pressure into these turbines, these cracks and pits very, very rapidly grow. You have shearing off of bits of the turbine, which then creates an instability in the turbine, which is then inevitably going to shear off. And these enormous machines are unbelievably dangerous. And, in Russia, dozens of people were killed in one such incident. You have these turbines, these inadequate turbines, revolving in this newly built Chinese dam upriver from this cascading catastrophe situation further down the river, and again, there has been totally inadequate, just me and my blog up to now, which has been publicising this troubling situation. Dam, yeah.
Mega dam.
Dam.
So how has the election of the new Prime Minister, Mahathir Mohamad, change the relationship between Malaysia and China?
Mahathir was Prime Minister of Malaysia for 20 years previously. He's a veteran and he's well known for being a crusty character. He's a very nationalist-minded character and he has defended Malaysia's independence against all outsiders and all great powers. He's been very capable, but extremely rude to the Brits, extremely rude to Trump and the Americans, and was also succeeded in going to China and being very, very straight with them as well. So he's an independent, he's for Malaysia's independence and for fighting against any outside power that attempts to exert undue influence. And I think he made that very clear, both to the Western powers but also to China. And he's made it clear that he intends to revise some of these deals that were made to bail out Najib. Malaysia has been looking very critically and openly and frankly at the corrupt nature of these deals and challenging China to back off, given that these deals were clearly laced with corruption.
Do you think China's interest in Malaysia will ultimately help or hurt?
I would hope that Malaysia and China can build a constructive relationship as between two equal countries. And I think China hopefully has got the message now that trying to seduce and corrupt effectively leaderships within countries like Malaysia can backfire, be embarrassing, show up China for tactics that would have been described as neo-colonialist or corrupting, that they will treat Malaysia with respect as an independent sovereign neighbour. And hopefully, this will end with better relations between these two neighbours.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for listening.